So today's seminar speaker is Dr Louise Hickman. It's a pleasure to introduce her. She's Senior Lecturer in Philosophy and Ethics at Newman University in Birmingham. She studied at the Universities of Exeter and Cambridge, where she completed a PhD at St Edmund's College here. Her main interests are in history and philosophy of religion and science and religion. She's the editor of Reviews in Science and Religion, which is the journal of the UK's Science and Religion Forum. She's published several articles on late 18th century thought and is currently writing a monograph, I'm told, entitled 18th Century Dissent and Cambridge Platonism. So it's a pleasure to welcome her today to us, and she's talking on resisting blind chance and senseless cosmos, historical perspectives on science, ethics and nature. Louise, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you. So there is a handout, and it has some quotes on it and the headings of the three parts of the paper, which I hope will make it easier to follow. It's my belief that the history of philosophy has much to offer the science-theology conversation. In this paper today, I want to offer some thoughts about how the history of the design argument might inform reflections on contemporary natural theology. I suggest that a consideration of Ralph Cudworth's 17th century platonically informed critique of materialism points us towards an ethically informed theology of nature, which challenges reductionist and utilitarian conceptions of the natural world, and which reasserts the centrality of ethics in our thinking about the non-human world. First, then, why history? It's a truism that we can't escape our history, but we regularly tend to overlook it when we consider our theological, scientific, and philosophical ideas and concepts. The 17th and 18th centuries are often quite rightly designated a heyday of natural theology, on account of the remarkable flourishing at this time of arguments for God's existence, in the form, for example, of design and cosmological arguments. Isaac Newton, Samuel Clarke, Robert Boyle, and William Paley are, if you like, the usual suspects who spring to mind, but there are, of course, many more. The way these historical arguments are understood tends to shape their contemporary articulations. For one thing, it's common to define natural theology as the inferring of God's existence from evidence observed in the natural world. Alvin Plantinga, for example, invites us to think of natural theology as the attempt to prove or demonstrate the existence of God. Alister McGrath offers a broader understanding of natural theology when he suggests that it is, I quote, a matter of historical fact, that it's better understood as a demonstration from the standpoint of faith of the consonance between that faith and the structures of the world. He sees order in nature not as a straightforward demonstration that God exists, but as he says, and I quote, it reinforces the plausibility of an already existing belief, unquote. Although broader than Plantinga's definition, McGrath still envisages natural theology as concerned with the defence or justification of belief. I think McGrath is absolutely right when he claims that many historical versions of natural theology presuppose the existence of God, but I believe they also have a remarkable ethical quality, and it's this feature that I would like to emphasise today. Attention to historical detail, I believe, can reframe our understanding of the design argument and highlight different priorities. What comes to light from contextualising some of the natural theologians of the 17th century is not first and foremost a worry about the rational justification of the propositions of faith, but an ethical and political philosophy of religion that challenges ethical relativism. What is important is not an appeal to inference, but a natural theology more along the lines of the kind of thinking espoused, for example, by Chris Southgate, for whom the contemplation of nature can reveal something of God and God's relationship with human beings. Furthermore, the 17th century natural theologians demand ethical reflection on our ways of seeing the world. Paying attention to the world thus becomes a much more pressing priority and makes natural theology inescapably ethical in character. Part 1 then, Ralph Cudworth and the design argument. William Paley tends to dominate our historical conceptions of Enlightenment era design arguments. His late 18th century version of it sought a similarity between natural and artificial mechanism and tried to establish the same kind of mechanical principles in human and divine contrivances. But not all design arguments are of a piece, and Paley's, I think, is different in crucial respects to some earlier articulations, particularly to the version found in the writings of the 17th century Anglican divine Ralph Cudworth. Cudworth was one of a number of 17th century thinkers associated with the University of Cambridge who've come to be known by some today as Cambridge Platonists. Whether or not they form a distinctive school of thought is debatable and a bit controversial in some circles, but certain convictions certainly unite them, particularly their positive account of human reason, an embrace of ancient Greek pagan philosophy, especially of Plato and Plotinus's philosophy, and the harmony they sought between philosophy, theology, and the new science. They're often depicted as Janus-faced, and I think this is quite appropriate because they glance backwards to the philosophy of antiquity, but also forwards to modernity by way of their embrace of the scientific revolution. And I think it's certainly true that they saw no conflict between science and their adherence to Christian belief. Ralph Cudworth is particularly important, I think. He's been noted for being the first thinker in English to use the term philosophy of religion. His True Intellectual System, his main book, which runs into 3 or 4 volumes, depending on which publication you look at, it aimed to establish, in his words, the belief of a God by philosophic reasons. And by doing this, he meant to deny that faith is full of inconsistent and contradictious notions. His ultimate purpose, however, was not the justification of propositional belief per se, but a defence of the objectivity of goodness, as opposed to the arbitrary power of will. Within Cudworth's True Intellectual System, I suggest there are elements of what have been identified in later 18th century writers as an argument from design, but also within his writings there is an argument to design. The argument from design assumes order within the natural world from which we can infer a designer. So this is a key characteristic of Paley's argument. But the argument to design is different. It argues essentially for a value-laden universe, and in Platonic terms, a universe that images the divine. Cudworth's targets, and this is just to put him in context, were twofold. First, the atheistic mechanism he saw in the ancient philosophers Epicurus and Democritus, and he thought reasserted by Thomas Hobbes. His second target was the theistic mechanism of Descartes' model, in which God acts with overriding power immediately on the universe. The link between Hobbes and Descartes, according to Cudworth, is the supremacy of will or voluntarism. And this he saw as a common thread woven through both Hobbesianism and Cartesianism in their model of nature. As Cudworth sees it, the atheist mechanistic model cannot avoid a universe characterised by blind chance. With no God to guide the process, a mechanistic world, he thought, can only come into being through fortuitous circumstances. So this is quote number 1. The atomists, he tells us, see life as no substantial thing, but only an accident or quality arising from the aggregation of atoms. In response to this position, Cudworth argues that the form of each animal and the system of the world as a whole are marked by regularities, and they act as if directed by wisdom, So as he sees it, mere fortune and chance, he says, could never have given rise to this, as the divine mind and wisdom has printed its seal on the matter of the corporeal world. He envisages a final cause for ends as the only proper explanation for events in nature. He sounds very like William Paley here, but the nub of Cudworth's argument concerns moral value. When he envisages his necessary final cause for ends, he means ends for goodness. Things are ordered by mind for the sake of good, he says. So this is an argument to design, because it is most fundamentally an argument about the nature of knowledge and ethical value. So the context then is anti-voluntarism. If, as Epicurus suggested, he says, the universe is ultimately composed of atoms in a void, then the only thing to live for is pleasure. And pleasure as determined by individual human will. Likewise, Hobbes's materialism depicts human desire as motivating the social contract, as a means to escape the distinctly undesirable brutish state of nature. For the atomist, therefore, and the mechanist, the human will asserts its preference and becomes the determinant of value. For the Cartesian too, voluntarism looms large. Descartes is wrong, Cudworth insists, to suggest that the natures of good and evil and all truth and falsehood depend on the arbitrary power of God. God, Cudworth thinks, cannot determine the laws of logic and make things like square circles. So Descartes was a theist, but like the atomist, he was a mechanist when it came to organic life. For Descartes, all natural bodies are entirely explicable according to the principles of mechanics and geometry. Both Hobbesian atheism and Descartes' form of theism, therefore, adopt voluntarist and mechanistic assumptions. Cudworth's argument rejects voluntarism entirely. The Hobbesian atheists are mistaken in his eyes, not just because they posit the wrong cause, that is, fortuitous mechanism, as the explanatory principle, but because they invert the meaning of telos. They argue essentially that things are not designed for their use, but come into being through their use. So knowledge, according to the atheist, as Cudworth sees it, can only come into existence with a knower. The problem with the atheist's account, therefore, is principally relativism, not unbelief. The Hobbesian atheist thus usurps knowledge and value and replaces it with power. The most important investigation for Cudworth is about ends. We must ask whether things are made by God for good or come into being by chance. Final causes and the direction of the universe by the wisdom of God, he thinks, are what ensure the natural world is underpinned with transcendent value. So this argument then applies against Descartes' mechanism. In England, the Cambridge Platonists were among Descartes' most forthright opponents, even though they adopted some of his philosophy. They resisted in particular Descartes' move to desacralise nature, and crucially to make it devoid of inherent value. For Descartes, there's no phenomenon of nature that can't be explained by the various sizes, shapes and motions which are found in all bodies. The crux of the Cambridge Platonist dispute with him was not so much the methodology of mechanism, but rather mechanism's metaphysical assumptions. The Cambridge Platonists embraced the explanatory power of mechanism as going far beyond scholastic philosophy, but, as one Cambridge Platonist, Anne Conway, puts it, mechanism's false foundational principle is the idea of what she calls dead matter. Matter that is dead can only come about through chance events and can have no explanation without considering some sort of intentions for ends and good. What's most important here, I think, is that for the Cambridge Platonists, a mechanical worldview cannot explain natural justice and morality. The Cartesian God determines these things by force of will, while for the Hobbesian, they're nothing but the result of contingent happenstance. And to illustrate this, we have quote number 2. In the mind of these atheists, the fortuitous concourse of similar or dissimilar atoms begets this whole system of heaven and earth, art or mind and understanding, being generated also in the last place out of these same senseless and inanimate bodies or elements, did produce certain other things which partake little of truth and reality, but are mere images. Above all, those moral differences of just and unjust, honest and dishonest. He goes on to say, when it comes to just and unjust for the atheist, there is by nature no such thing at all. Hobbesian indeterminacy and Cartesian mechanism thus form two sides of the same voluntaristic coin. Goodness is dissolved into power, and this has worrying despotic political implications for Cudworth. Hobbes used his voluntarism to insist on the absolute sovereignty of the Leviathan state, and this galvanised Cudworth to reply that goodness and justice are immutable, not subject to will, and he also insisted that religion is not determined by the ficture or imposture of politicians. Those in power do not get to determine what is right or just. Instead, as we're told in quote 3, truth is bigger than our minds, and we are not the same with it. The voluntarism of both Hobbes and Cudworth then has two unsavoury consequences for Cudworth. The first, which I've just discussed, is the belief that ethical value is created by the will as opposed to having independent, objective existence. The second, which follows on from the first, is that nature itself is devoid of inherent value. Cudworth's adoption of an argument to design makes an appreciation for final causes, or in other words, the moral basis of the cosmos, the catalyst that leads us to a view of nature itself as full of reasons, power and order. The idea of participation is crucial here. Cudworth says in quote number 4, "Wherefore, since the world is not like those works that are artificially made and compacted by men, but hath a participation of life and divinity, which God has inserted into it and mingled with it. God is therefore rightly styled by Plato, not only the maker, but also the father of the whole world." The cosmos for Cudworth participates in the divine by imaging the divine, and this is a common theme for Platonic thought. Nature is not dead and mechanical, but, as for example Proclus asserts, it proceeds from that supreme goddess, the divine wisdom, which is the fountain of all life, both intellectual life and life within matter. For Cudworth, then, the natural world is infused with divine life. A metaphysics of participation means morality is not just existent in a transcendent sense, but it's part and parcel of the physical makeup of the cosmos. The physical universe is a moral universe, and true philosophy becomes a moral enterprise. So matter is not dead precisely because it's saturated with value. This gives the natural world a value and reality of its own, completely undetermined by human will. The origin of this philosophy lies in Plato. Plato's laws contain one of the earliest recorded arguments against what Plato calls the heresy that gods do not exist, and it argues in defence of their care for human beings. So Plato is the first thinker in the West to argue that the gods care for us, they don't use us for their sport. That Plato's argument proceeds from features of the physical world makes it one of the first examples of natural theology in the Western canon. Like Cudworth, Plato is opposed to materialism and to the idea of chance on ethical grounds. Those who deny the existence of the god, Plato says, propose that order, life and regularity are the result of chance. The consequence of this position is that absolute standards become a matter of human design or convention. In response to this suggestion, Plato links design with what he calls soul and opposes both to matter and chance. In this sense, soul comes before matter. Plato is often assumed to be quite a rigorous substance dualism here, but this is not really substance dualism because it's principally a moral rather than a metaphysical standpoint. It means that soul, not matter, is the origin of good and evil. because a universe that is a random collection of matter cannot contain true goodness. Soul, Plato says, is the cause of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice. And this basic conviction underpins the Platonic corpus in its railing against the relativism of the sophists, those thinkers in ancient Greek who went around teaching the art of public speaking for money. Design concerns the ordering of the universe towards the good, without which justice can only ever be in the interests of the stronger, as Thrasymachus states in the Republic. It's the Platonic conviction that, contra Thrasymachus and others like Protagoras, human beings are not the measure of all things. When natural theology first appears in Western thought, then, it's first and foremost an argument against ethical relativism. That the universe is a moral universe, in the sense that it has inherent value, is a central theme of Plato's Timaeus dialogue. In the myth of creation outlined here, Plato describes a demiurge modelling creation on the archetypal ideas, present to the divine mind, but all the time independent of will. Through this model of creation, the cosmos is infused with divine value. Intelligence thus permeates everything from the world soul to the level of individual particles, including the human soul. This means the human soul has a mediating function between the physical and intelligible realm. But this is not necessarily positing a hierarchy of soul and body. The abstract or the intellectual is not more real or of higher status necessarily. The natural world is not something to be transcended or overcome. As Stephen Clarke points out more recently, the suggestion that this is a hierarchy is a travesty of Plato's position and that of most Platonists. The Timaeus describes the rational soul part of humans in mythical terms as made of the same ingredients as the world soul. The immortal intellect is crucial to our nature, but this is shared with non-human animals. And this becomes the root of a Platonist sacramental theism, in which each type of creature is capable of revealing real beauty or one particular aspect of the divine. The divine, or the design of the cosmos for Plato, is about seeing the world as the embodiment of ethical value. So it's the ontological priority of design, or what Douglas Headley calls art, over chance, that is characteristic of this Platonic adoption of the argument in Plato's laws. So Plotinus adopts this, and it also reappears in Cudworth's argument to design. The chance universe is akin to the mechanical one because both leave truth and value in a very precarious state. For Epicurus, there can be no good beyond the moment's joy. And for Hobbes, there can be no value except what will asserts. What conclusions can we draw from this? Well, I suggested at the beginning of this paper that the future prospects of theology of nature are promising. So I'll now outline two particular ways a Platonic Cudworthian approach might be developed. And this first involves considerations of the nature of truth and value, and the second is concerned with the contemplation of nature. So I'm moving on now to part two, the nature of truth and value. Cudworth's argument to design focuses on final cause for ends, principally goodness, and it offers a riposte to the attempt to explain ethical considerations in materialistic terms. Cudworth offers a reminder of the difficulties of a sort of scientistic approach when it comes to explaining moral value. And John Cottingham presents a contemporary form of this argument, I think, when he insists that although God cannot serve as an explanation for the world in the same way as a scientific explanation, God might instead be seen as the source of goodness in the world. The alternative is, as both Cottingham and before him Cudworth recognise, a form of ethical voluntarism. Cottingham's foil is J.L. Mackie, not Hobbes, but the argument is essentially the same. Mackie's relativism denies the real existence of objective moral properties and sees them as a projection of our preferences. For Mackie, just as much as for Thrasymachus or Hobbes, the power of will is promoted in place of objective value. As Cottingham argues, if goodness is to be objective, some sort of account is needed of how certain features of things have not just instrumental value, but unconditional or categorical action guiding force. And Cottingham, I think, is at his most platonic when he points out that this is difficult or near impossible without a commitment to a theistic account of a universe which is ordered towards goodness. This is what a Platonist would call a universe modelled on good as an archetype. Like Cudworth, Cottingham insists that without this commitment to theism, we might as well fight against mercy and compassion and other ethical values. Moral goodness can only really exist, and we can only have reason to choose it, if the universe has some sort of moral teleology behind it. And this, I think, is also Jack Hort's argument when he insists that a chance materialistic universe struggles to explain moral value and also science's commitment to truth. Hort calls attention to the difficulties faced by Paley's argument in the way it tends to make God a cause among other causes. This means that contemporary scientific naturalism has little room left for any non-naturalistic explanations of the process of evolution and the general development of the cosmos. But the spirit of Cudworth's argument to design, I think, is in harmony with Hort's suggestion that God must be seen as a different type of explanation. What Michael Roos terms a methodological naturalism, which means natural phenomena can be explained using the methods of science, is entirely in keeping with a theistic worldview. But without some commitment to God or transcendent goodness, we cannot explain why we should search for knowledge in the first place, i.e. we can't explain why the search for truth is a good thing. Furthermore, as Hort points out, without a theistic commitment, we've no reason to accept the assumption that our limited human reason can ever gain an understanding of the universe. So this argument calls attention to the way in which science itself is based on some sort of faith, that the world is rational, that truth is something to be valued and to be respected, if we want to make use of experts, I suppose. Then our minds, we have to have this conviction for our minds to understand truth. But a neo-Darwinian espousing a world emerging from chance events cannot be sure about scientific knowledge and cannot have any real conviction that it's a good thing to search for this knowledge. So as Hort puts it in quote number 5, I am questioning whether evolutionary accounts are enough to account ultimately for the trust that you, Gould, Flanagan, Wilson and Dawkins spontaneously place in your own minds to lead you and me to the truth. The strength of Hort's argument, I think, rests on a commitment to the unity of goodness and truth. Truth is in principle discoverable, and it's a good thing to try and discover it. So the naturalist, neo-Darwinian, someone like Dawkins, for example, is pushed to the opposite conclusion. Without the teleology envisaged by Hort, Cottingham, and the Platonists more generally, evolutionary explanation should lead the neo-Darwinists to doubt their mind's capacity to put them in touch with truth. And all this, I think, brings to mind the question that troubled Charles Darwin himself, which I've put as quote number 6. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which have been developed from the minds of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? As Stephen Clarke argues, many Platonist thinkers, and I think we should include Cudworth here, realised way before Darwin that if the immutable archetypes of beauty and value are replaced by materialistic chance events, then in fact there is no real beauty in the universe. Imagining that God does not exist, Clarke says, amounts to denying that there is discoverable truth or any truth worth discovering. Furthermore, this means that if there were no forms of beauty and immutable goodness, science itself would be impossible. Only a universe ordered towards truth and goodness can safeguard the whole scientific enterprise. So moving on to part number 3, the contemplation of nature. That the universe is orientated towards goodness is not merely an abstract idea or an explanatory principle for the Platonist, but it has profound ethical implications. Descartes' model of nature is one of a world subject to power, the power of God and the power of human beings to control it for their own ends. Nature thus becomes like a resource, and its use determined by utilitarian principles. A Christian Platonic model, on the other hand, in which nature is suffused with value, makes the world worthy of contemplation. That the cosmos is orientated to the good means that the world has its own integrity. It images the divine and becomes something we can learn from. Our attitude towards the natural world and its role in knowledge become important here. The Timaeus' account of intellectual virtue, which depicts us as made of mortal and immortal parts, is concerned first and foremost with moral attitude rather than the superiority of human beings. This idea is taken up by Plotinus, for whom the position of the soul in the cosmos is not fixed. Its being, its ethical and physical quality, instead depends on its attitude or behaviour, on the direction it takes, which can either be towards the world of nous or spirit, or towards corporeal nature. So this idea becomes a central tenet of English Platonism. But this does not mean that Platonism asserts two different realities. Instead, it means we're capable of looking at the same reality in two different ways. Reductive scientific paradigms, this is one way, inevitably imagine living things according to a model of mechanism. And this, as Grace Jansen, the philosopher, points out, determines how they are studied. An alternative way of looking at the world make goodness and beauty part of the cosmos, and then the cosmos becomes inherently valuable. The natural world is then no longer resource but bearer of divine image, no longer a mechanistic system, but as Plotinus might put it, a living organism. Stephen Clarke calls this looking upwards at the whole, and it's a basic refusal of reductionism. Clarke himself points to the harmony between Plotinus and the Abrahamic faiths on this. Clarke says, we believe in God, if the one is God, when we manage to comprehend reality as a well-ordered whole, a thing of multiple beauty unified in love. This amounts to a robust challenge to any suggestion that utility, or what Pamela Sue Anderson terms self-mastery, should be the goal of science. It also affirms how our ways of looking are ethically loaded. When the Cambridge Platonists sought harmony between philosophy, theology and science, they were reminding their contemporaries that science is essentially a moral discipline. The questions it deems worth asking and the way that it carves up the world is not necessarily ethically neutral. For the Platonists, therefore, the prioritising of mind above matter is an ethical commitment. This insists, as Douglas Headley puts it, that the world is neither a collection of neutral facts, nor is it a kaleidoscope of our projected fancies. Advances in the sciences have obviously taken us well beyond Cartesian and Hobbesian mechanism, but the motivation for Cudworth's dissatisfaction with Hobbes and Descartes still applies. The dominant way of looking at nature in the sciences still neglects, by and large, any real appreciation of the value inherent in natural things in favour of the method of quantification. And as Karen Corrigan argues, contemporary science tends to replace the contemplation of natural things for their own sake with experimentation for our own sake. And the result, as he goes on to argue in quote 7, is that the practice of science is made supposedly value-free by excluding religious, metaphysical, moral and political perspectives, while it actually too often allows for hidden exploitation by interest groups, including those that are corporate, private or governmental. An argument to design thus presents an ethical imperative to uncover what lies hidden in our visions of the natural world, including the still dominant scientific model of nature as a resource. In conclusion then, the history of the design argument highlights the ethical nature of our ways of seeing. It compels us too to strive for an understanding of reality that considers the world not just in terms of its use for us or in terms of its market value, but as the bearer of innate value. Such a shift in vision presents a new model for scientific knowing. A method of quantification is replaced by contemplation. And in this reconceived theology of nature, learning from nature becomes an imperative. And there are, for a start, I think, inescapable eco-theological implications here, for example. A Christian Platonic eco-theology will, I propose, involve using nature as some sort of a guide as to how we should live. Nature must become an active partner in theology, rather than the grounds for a more passive inference about divine existence. In this theology of nature, the most pressing question is, how should I live? And in answering this question, we must see ourselves as part of a much larger whole, a wider community of beings. What these historical perspectives on the design argument point towards, I suggest, is something akin to what Pamela Sue Anderson calls a theology of nature. This is one involving critical reflection on our models of the cosmos and how we relate to the world around us. We must learn to challenge the all too dominant utilitarian way of seeing the world, and on the basis of commitment to the value of the cosmos, we must see the world as more than what is projected onto it by human life. And I think we must think more critically about how we live and interact with the non-human world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for questions, and there's already hands up. So I think Andrew there, and then I think come forward a little bit.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. It seems to me you don't need to be an atomist or a reductionist or a materialist, or even to understand evolutionary mechanisms, to see that nature is not consistently oriented to goodness of the kind that we can base our ethics upon. Hence the naturalistic fallacy that's so often quoted. So I'm just curious as to how the Neoplatonists thought they could derive ethics from the natural world separate from divine revelation.
Yes, thank you. With the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, I suppose they had less of an understanding of, say, evolutionary suffering, which we are all too aware of today. But within Platonism, I think that the argument is more towards looking at whether ethical values are ultimately real or not. So it's not about just looking at the natural world and kind of reading off ethical principles from that, which obviously Hume and other philosophers had an enormous issue with. I think it is just about thinking more generally in terms of thinking about how we might be more in harmony perhaps with nature in terms of that wider community. So for example, at the moment, most of our approaches to the environmental problems that we have tend to rely very much on technological means. So we pursue technological problems or solutions to the problems that we have. Whereas I think that a model based on the contemplation of nature perhaps asks us to seek how we might live more in harmony with that nature, which then might point us away from things like sort of mass factory farming, away from use of chemicals and pesticides, and more towards thinking about how we might live in a way that's more in harmony with nature, more sort of subsistence farming or different models of that. So rather than seeing our technology and science as being put to use principally for us, we think about the needs and the requirements of non-natural creatures. So I think it's more about that really than reading a straight ethic out of how the natural world acts. It's perhaps more about thinking in terms of the whole and how we might live more in harmony with the world around us. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's Lydia here.
I have two questions, if I may. So the first question, you said that Plato was the first Western thinker to say that the gods care for us. I was just wondering about the word care, because it would imply a kind of personal interest in humanity. And I don't quite know, or I would have thought that Platonist gods are not personal, and therefore there's nothing like caring for them.
So yeah, I'll answer that one first before the second one then. Yes, I mean, what theism was for Plato is obviously very controversial, and I think Socrates perhaps has a slightly more personalist view of theism than Plato. And obviously Plato talks about the gods and the goddesses. Now he seems to accept their existence alongside having a sort of a concept of the good, or whatever that was, we're not quite sure. But he certainly reacted against the sort of dominant view that the gods and the goddesses have no concern whatsoever for human beings. So he does seem to allow for some sort of providential care. And the demiurge, for example, in the Timaeus, demiurge creates based on the archetype, but there's this idea that perhaps within that process of creation there is some sort of concern that everything is ultimately ordered towards the good. And I think that's where the sort of providential care comes through, because I tell you, you're absolutely right, there isn't a developed personalistic theism within Platonic thought, but I think this reaction against the ancient Greek idea that the gods just use us for their sport and have no care for us whatsoever, combined with that sort of view that things are ordered to the good, I think that perhaps made it quite a coherent fit with later personalist theistic ideas.
The second question would be, so I see the point of Platonism, where this makes a difference for our relationship to nature and how we view it. But why Christian Platonism? So I think, for example, of somebody like Thomas Nagel, who just thinks there are these objective ethical values out there, but he is not a Christian. So why make this further step, or is it necessary, or can we just stop with Platonism?
I think if you stop with Platonism, it perhaps becomes more problematic, because without the personal theism, it's quite hard to say how things can be ordered ultimately to the good. And Iris Murdoch is another one, isn't she? A very, very strongly Platonic thinker who is an atheist. And I think in those positions of sort of atheist Platonism, I think it struggles really. There's a tension there, which is perhaps resolved more with a personalist sort of theistic Christian Platonism. So yeah, I think ultimately a non-personalist Platonism has an issue answering how it can be that everything is ordered towards the good, ultimately.
Question over there, and you okay? That says one of I think that's a hand over here.
Good afternoon. In your presentation, you quoted Darwin to the effect that how could the mind of a man, having developed from lower animals, have convictions of any value or be trustworthy? Well, my question would be, in that case, at least you know what the logic was and you know what evidence the conviction was based on. So why should that be less trustworthy than a conviction that comes from someone's mind, which is claimed to be the revealed word of God, for example, or an interpretation of what God would want? Why should that be any less trustworthy, any more trustworthy than conviction based on scientific evidence?
Yes, I think perhaps I'll say two things in response to that. This is a really interesting question, I think. That the thinkers that I've discussed here wouldn't necessarily think we can trust every conviction in someone's mind. So just if we have a conviction, that doesn't mean our conviction is necessarily true. But if we have some belief that in principle we can have convictions that are either true or false, then it gives us a reason to pursue that truth and a reason to be self-critical as well as critical of others. Because if there's no commitment to truth and no commitment to goodness beyond our own heads, then there's no incentive to go searching for that truth. So this conviction that truth is out there somehow gives us the conviction to search for it and gives us a reason why it is we can challenge other people, and it gives us a reason to challenge our own convictions as well. So I think Platonism itself is actually very, very humble about our ability to know the truth. So there is always an epistemic humility within Platonism. So the good always goes beyond being. You know, Plato says the good is beyond being. So we can't necessarily have much knowledge of it, but at least if we have the conviction that it's there, then we must try and make sure that our beliefs do somehow relate to that reality. But yeah, the other point, I actually struggle perhaps a bit with the distinction that Darwin raises between the convictions of non-human minds and the convictions of human minds, because actually if that universe is ordered towards the good, then why couldn't it be that a non-human mind would contain convictions that are potentially truthful? So in a sense, why assume that somehow we are necessarily completely superior to non-human creatures? So we often make assumptions when we consider non-human animals like whales and dolphins, for example, that they somehow, you know, we're only just discovering, for example, that they have a huge amount of empathy and they communicate at a very advanced level. So I mean, if we do all that and we assume that we have some connection with truth, then why not assume that of other non-human species as well?
You use the microphone a minute.
Sorry. Yes, thank you for that. But I still don't see how your argument says that that the word conviction is perhaps the wrong one, but a conclusion is probably a better one. How a conclusion that you come to and will be tested, well, what you have to demonstrate and will be debated by your fellow scientists is less trustworthy than one that you claim, the individual concerned claims, has come through some sort of revelation or deep thought. There's no more incentive for a scientist to sort of be untruthful than there is for that person.
Yeah, although the views here would say they wouldn't be against the empirical sciences, for example, so that would be a good way of testing a belief. So Cudworth and the other Platonists would not deny the importance of the sciences in testing our empirical beliefs. The issue is whether we have a conviction about truth somehow going above and beyond what we will. So I suppose it's whether it's about a question whether science is purely pragmatic or whether science in some way discovers reality. Does that make it clearer? Or?
Sorry, yes. It's the word trustworthy. I mean, you're saying that one way of thinking is untrustworthy, and you haven't really justified it, in my view.
I'm not saying the human mind is untrustworthy, though. I would say the human mind is trustworthy to some extent, and most scientists presumably would see the world as trustworthy, the human mind as trustworthy to some extent. So it's a question about how we can be certain that our minds are in any way trustworthy. Because a scientist would want to see his or her mind as perhaps, well, the empirical sciences do give us a trustworthiness of our mind. So I'm not saying it's untrustworthy, I'm trying to make the point that it is trustworthy.
Thank you. Can we move the microphone along, Rodney?
Thanks. I think this is all quite related to Plantinga's argument that if evolution, I mean, you might comment on it. You know, if you know, evolution is all based on survival value, then how can we have a handle on truth? I mean, it might help us to survive in the primitive conditions of hunter-gatherers and so on. But what we have is a sort of much deeper handle on truth. So perhaps you want to comment on Plantinga's argument?
Yes.
Other arguments like C.S. Lewis has gone, similar arguments along these lines.
That's right, and I think particularly Lewis's argument is actually very Platonic when he talks about this, and I think this is the point that Plantinga is making, really, because is he the one who talks about we could be wrestling with crocodiles but not actually be aware of it, and I think that's the point, really, and that's the point that Hort is picking up on as well, that if you just take the sort of neo-Darwinian evolutionist idea, then there is no guarantee that our ideas are any fit with truth whatsoever. So it is that commitment to truth as something objective and external and something which is not dependent on our will. It's only that then that means that we can have any belief that our conviction or our minds are trustworthy. Yeah, does that help? Yeah.
There's a question over there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You said at one point, and I can't quite remember the context, that for there to be something known, there has to be a knower. And it changed the object and the position of a known fact from being a static thing, a reified object, into a process or a verb or a doing thing. And there has to be an agent in a doing thing. There has to be an owner of the person doing the knower, as it were. And I just wondered, that changes the whole scope of it, doesn't it? Because it turns it to being from something that is now not beyond the knower. It's within the knower, or it's at the mercy of the knower. It changes the nature of what is knowable and valuable if you turn it from a reified thing into a verb.
Yeah, I think what I meant with that was to emphasise how, for the sort of Hobbesian view, it is the knower that determines the knowledge, whereas with Cudworth's position, he was just concerned to emphasise that truth is immutable and absolute. And I suppose what he was perhaps trying to balance was the inevitable assumptions that we do put on our knowledge. So knowledge is, in that sense, a verb. We do bring our own prejudices to the table, but at the same time, he's trying to give us a reason or an incentive to try to overcome that by having a truth which is not necessarily completely knowable, but is at least in principle discoverable. So I think that's what I meant, really. It was more to it was more about resisting the sort of very utilitarian accounts of knowledge, where human beings determine what knowledge is. So again, I suppose they were taking the stand against subjectivism and relativism in that sense. So yes, perhaps that should be a bit clearer.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll draw things to a close at that point. Can you join me in thanking Louise for a fascinating presentation?
Thank you.